David Foster had lost everything quietly, which was the only way his brother Eric had ever known how to take things. Not through confrontation, but through paperwork, patience, and the particular cruelty of someone who understood exactly which documents mattered before anyone else realized they existed. Judge Renata Cole looked down from her bench at a custody hearing that had gone, over the past 2 hours, almost entirely against David. His brother's attorney had built a case on fabricated text messages, a falsified income statement, and a psychological evaluation conducted, through a scheduling irregularity nobody had caught in time, by an evaluator who turned out to be close personal friends with Eric's wife. David had 2 children, 8-year-old twins, Noah and Grace. He was about to lose both of them to his own brother, a man who had decided, after their father's death left a modest inheritance unevenly divided in David's favor, that the courts could be made to correct what he considered an unfair will. Judge Cole said, "Mr. Foster, based on the evidence presented today, I see no path to anything other than awarding primary custody to your brother and his wife. The pattern of instability documented here is significant." David's attorney, Diane Walsh, 63, 31 years in family law, 2 months from retirement, stood up slowly. She said, "Your Honor, their grandmother is in the hallway." 5 words. The courtroom went completely silent. Because Eric Foster had told this court, under oath, an hour earlier, that the children's grandmother, David and Eric's own mother, had passed away 3 years ago. She had not, and she was about to walk through that door. David Foster was 36 years old and had spent most of his adult life being the quiet brother. Not because he lacked ambition, but because Foster Hardware Distribution, the business their father built, had only ever needed one loud personality at the top, and Eric had claimed that role at 19 with the particular permanence of a man who never considered it might belong to someone else. David had worked in operations for 14 years. He managed the warehouses, the logistics contracts, the supplier relationships that actually kept the business running, while Eric handled the parts of the company that appeared in photographs, ribbon cuttings, Chamber of Commerce dinners, the local business journal feature that had run his brother's photo 3 separate times over the years and never once mentioned David's name. Their father, Walter Foster, had known the difference. He had watched both sons for 61 years, and when he wrote his will, he had not divided the business equally. He had given David 60%. He had given Eric 40. The will had included a letter, handwritten, addressed to both sons, read aloud by the family attorney after the funeral, that explained the decision in Walter's own plain language. "Eric, you built the face of this company, and that mattered. David, you built the bones of it, and that matters more. A business without bones falls down, no matter how good the face looks. I'm sorry if this hurts you, son. I'm not sorry I did it." Eric had not spoken to David for 6 months after that letter was read. He had not contested the will. There was no legal basis to. But something had shifted permanently in him, a resentment that had no legal remedy and that he had carried, quietly, for 3 years, waiting for an opportunity that did not require a courtroom focused on inheritance. David's divorce, finalized 18 months ago, had given him that opportunity. Custody of Noah and Grace had initially been straightforward, joint, amicable, both parents genuinely committed to the children's stability. Then Eric had approached David's ex-wife, Melissa, 6 months ago. Not with money, not directly, with sympathy, with careful, patient conversations about how difficult David's work schedule must be, how the twins might benefit from more stability, more family involvement, the kind of extended support that only a loving uncle willing to step in could provide. Melissa had not understood, at first, that she was being recruited into a strategy. By the time she did understand, by the time the fabricated text messages appeared, supposedly showing David making threatening statements he had never made, by the time the falsified income documents suggested instability that didn't exist, she was already entangled in a legal process that had momentum she couldn't easily stop. David had not understood any of it until the hearing had already begun. Diane Walsh had taken David's case 9 months ago, after a referral from a former client who described David's situation with a single sentence that had made Diane set down her coffee and actually listen. His own brother is doing to him exactly what my ex-husband's family did to me. Except worse because it's blood. Diane was 63 years old. She had 31 years of family law experience, and she had spent the last decade of those years developing a reputation among judges, among opposing counsel, among the small community of attorneys who handled difficult custody matters in this county, for a particular kind of thoroughness that younger attorneys sometimes mistook for slowness. It was not slowness. It was the specific patience of someone who had learned, across 3 decades, that the cases that looked unwinnable in month 1 were sometimes won entirely in month 9 by a single piece of information that had taken that long to locate and verify properly. She had noticed something in David's case file early on that bothered her. The mother. David's case history mentioned, in passing, a mother who had passed away. Information that had come from Eric's side of the family record, repeated without verification because nobody had any reason to question it. Diane had a habit of questioning things anyway. She had spent 3 months, quietly, working through public records before she found what she was looking for. Margaret Foster was alive. She was 74 years old. She lived in an assisted living facility 2 hours away, under her maiden name, having left the area entirely 8 years earlier after a private and painful falling out with Eric over money he had borrowed from her retirement savings and never repaid. She had not spoken to either son in years, but she had never died. And when Diane found her, sat across from her in the modest common room of that assisted living facility and explained exactly what was happening to David's children. Margaret Foster, who had not seen her grandchildren in person in 4 years, had agreed, without hesitation, to come and tell the truth. Judge Cole said, "Ms. Walsh, I'm not sure I understand the relevance of Your Honor. Opposing counsel told this court, under oath an hour ago, that the children's grandmother passed away 3 years ago. That statement is false. She is alive. She is in the hallway. And she has testimony directly relevant to the credibility of the evidence this court has been asked to rely on today." Eric Foster, at the opposing table, had gone very still. His attorney leaned toward him and whispered something. Eric did not respond. Judge Cole looked at Eric for a long moment. She said, "Mr. Foster, is this true?" Eric said nothing. Judge Cole said, "I'll ask again. Is your mother alive?" Eric said, finally, quietly, "Yes." The courtroom did not erupt. Courtrooms rarely do, in the dramatic way television suggests, but the quality of the silence changed completely. The particular silence of a room where everyone has just understood that the entire foundation of the previous 2 hours requires reconsideration. Judge Cole said, "Bring her in." Margaret Foster walked into the courtroom slowly, using a cane, 74 years old, dressed simply, her expression showing the particular composure of a woman who had rehearsed this moment in her mind many times over the past 3 months and had decided, completely, that she would not waver. She was sworn in. Diane asked her 3 questions. "Mrs. Foster, are you the mother of David and Eric Foster?" "I am." "Have you had any direct contact with David Foster regarding his children's well-being, his parenting, or his financial circumstances in the past 2 years?" "None at all. I haven't spoken to David in over 4 years. That estrangement is mine to own. It has nothing to do with him being a poor father. It has to do with a private family matter between myself and Eric." "Were you aware that Eric told this court you were deceased?" Margaret looked at Eric for a long moment. She said, "I was not aware until 2 months ago, when Mrs. Walsh found me. I want to be honest with this court. Finding out that my own son told a judge I was dead, in order to take his brother's children, was the most difficult thing I have heard in many years." She paused. "I don't know everything about this case. I haven't read the documents. But I know my son Eric, and I know that he has never once, in his entire life, told the truth when a more useful version was available to him. I'm not saying that to hurt him. I'm saying it because a judge deserves to know it before she decides anything about 2 children's lives." What the fabrication required Judge Cole called a recess. When the hearing resumed, she had a different question. "Ms. Walsh, if the grandmother's death was fabricated in testimony, I want to understand what else in this case file requires independent verification before I rule on anything." Diane had anticipated this question. She had prepared for it for 3 months. She presented, methodically, the same way she had built every piece of the case. The text message thread that David's phone carrier record showed had never been sent from his number at the Times claimed. The income statement that didn't match David's actual tax filings, filed months earlier, completely unaltered with the IRS. And the psychological evaluator, whose undisclosed personal relationship with Eric's wife had been confirmed through a simple records search that opposing counsel's team had apparently never bothered to run on their own expert witness. Judge Cole listened to all of it without interrupting. When Diane finished, the judge was quiet for a long moment. She looked at Eric. She said, "Mr. Foster, I want to be very direct with you. What I have heard in the last 30 minutes suggests a sustained, deliberate effort to deceive this court in order to remove 2 children from their father's custody based on evidence I now have serious reason to believe was substantially fabricated. That is not a custody dispute. That is potentially perjury and potentially fraud upon this court, and I intend to refer this matter to the district attorney's office for review." The courtroom was completely silent. Judge Cole turned to David. Her tone, when she spoke to him, had changed entirely from the tone she had used 2 hours earlier. "Mr. Foster, I owe you an apology for how close this court came to a decision built on evidence I should have scrutinized more carefully before today. I am dismissing the petition for change of custody in full. Primary custody remains with you, under the existing arrangement with your ex-wife, unchanged." She looked at her notes. "I'm also ordering a formal investigation into the conduct of opposing counsel in this matter, separate from the criminal referral regarding Mr. Foster's testimony." David sat at the defense table. He did not cry. Not yet. Not in the courtroom. Because 14 years of being the quiet brother had taught him a particular discipline about which feelings belonged in which rooms. But his hands, folded in front of him, were not entirely steady. Diane sat down beside him. She said quietly, "You held together better than most people would have." David said, "I kept thinking about Noah and Grace asking why they couldn't see me anymore. I couldn't let myself think past that, or I wasn't going to make it through today." Diane nodded. "You don't have to think past it now." David walked past him toward the door where Margaret was waiting, leaning on her cane, watching her 2 sons with an expression that contained everything a mother's expression can contain after watching exactly this kind of moment unfold. Margaret and David stopped in front of his mother. He had not seen her in over 4 years. He said, "Mom." She said, "David." Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she reached out and took his hand. She said, "I should have come back sooner. I let my own anger at Eric keep me away from you, and those children for years I can't get back." David said, "You came when it mattered most. That's not the same as coming when it should have mattered all along." David was quiet for a moment. He said, "Would you like to meet them? Properly? Not as a witness. As their grandmother." Margaret's composure, which had held through the entire hearing, finally gave way slightly. She said, "I would like that more than almost anything." Eric Foster was charged 11 weeks later with perjury and attempted fraud upon the court. His attorney negotiated a plea, 18 months probation, mandatory counseling, and a permanent bar from any future custody-related legal action against David without independent court-appointed review. He did not contest the criminal referral. There was, in the end, very little left to contest. The family business was restructured quietly. David did not seek to remove Eric from the company entirely, despite Diane's advice that he had every legal basis to do so. And instead of working that out the right way, he tried to take something of mine instead. Noah said, "That's not fair." "No," David said, "it's not. But the judge figured that out, and you're staying with me, and that's what matters." Grace said, "Is Grandma really going to come visit?" "Every month, starting this weekend." The twins looked at each other with the particular delight of children who had just been handed unexpected good news in the middle of a confusing few months. Margaret's first visit Margaret Foster visited that Saturday. She arrived using her cane, slowly, and Noah and Grace ran to the door before David had even fully opened it. She knelt down, carefully, with effort, and put her arms around both of them at once. She said, "I am so sorry it took me this long." Grace said, "That's okay, Grandma. You're here now. Margaret held on to that sentence for the rest of the afternoon, repeating it quietly to herself at several points during the visit, as though she needed to keep proving to herself that it was actually true. David watched from the kitchen doorway. Diane Walsh, who had stopped by briefly to drop off final paperwork related to the case closure, stood beside him. She said, "This is the part of the job I actually do it for, not the verdicts." This. David said, "Thank you for finding her. For all 9 months." Diane said, "Your father wrote a letter that said you built the bones of something that matters more than the face of it. I think that's true about more than the business, David." She looked at the living room. Margaret on the floor with her grandchildren, laughing now, the particular sound of a family beginning to repair something that had been broken for a long time. She said, "This is what bones look like when somebody finally takes the time to find them."